see.
Make sure that
Kind of high. I
You
should
got
have checked this before.
yeah.
No, I've got a mic.
You got your own mic. Okay.
You can hear me, right? Good morning.
Good morning.
I'm going to start by telling you how my book came about, because writing the book was partly an experiment in what I think all of us need to do as we get older. In my mid-60s, I looked back over my life and asked myself, what had I done among many projects and teaching in different institutions and educational planning and so on? What had I done that I thought had to have two characteristics? It had to be something I knew I was good at, and it had to be something that I really believed had been helpful to people. And I realized that of all my writings and all my work, probably what had the most useful impact was a book called Composing a Life. In fact, I plagiarized the title for the new book. I wrote that book during the period of the feminist movement, when a lot of women were trying to figure out how to combine career and family. And there was a metaphor that was used commonly. I'm afraid it still is used. I fought it every time I get a chance. It was the metaphor of juggling. Now, that's a very anxiety-producing metaphor, right? I mean, me, I'm a klutz. If you tell me I have to juggle my marriage, my citizenship, my job, my church, I'm going to drop at least two of them. All right? So, essentially, I asked myself the question, what metaphor will allow people to think differently about this new challenge that so many women faced 40 years ago? What would be a positive metaphor for combining all these different responsibilities, commitments, challenges, competing with each other? How do you talk about combining things in a harmonious and balanced way that adds up to something you can be proud of? I remember one woman said to me, my husband says I'm not serious. I keep changing what I do. Well, by the time I was her age, I was on my 5th career. Because my husband kept moving to different places and doing the same thing, better and better, and I kept going with him and doing something different and improvising. I'm getting a lot of nods. A lot of people have been through this, okay? So it's really important to have a way of thinking about it. And so I came up with the concept of composing. I had a mental image of some of these oil paintings you see from the 19th century of a table, a still life, and there's some flowers, and maybe a violin, and I don't know, a fish, or a pheasant. A lot of them have pheasants on the table. But the point is that conceptually, you take these things that don't fit together and you put them in a composition, and then when you paint them, you're always changing the way you emphasize, the way you highlight, so that the painting hangs together. All right? So what I wanted to say to women finding their way into quite a different way of thinking about their lives is think about yourselves not as juggling and struggling and dropping things, but as striving to create something beautiful. Think of yourselves as artists of your lives, making a composition of grace of the many different things that you're trying to do. It's still out there. People are still reading it. Now, what has happened, of course, with the increased longevity is everyone, men and women, has to rethink their lives again. What you do when? What's the rhythm? What are the transitions? What happens in what period of a life? What do you learn in each period? Because everyone is learning at every stage of life, even to their last final days, I believe. So in a sense, it was the same question. There I was in my mid-60s, and trying to answer the question of, if I think of my life as a piece of art, what do I now need to do to complete the composition? So a set of questions. One was the what next question. One was the what have I done best and most usefully in the past. And the third question is, where is the need? What is the question that the society is asking? And I came up with the notion that I would write a book. At first I thought it was a book about aging. That I would write a book using the same methodology that I had used in writing Composing a Life, including putting my own experiences in it, and using people's real names. And that's an important issue because, on the one hand, many social scientists feel it's very important to disguise anybody they write about. Well, I always have permission to use people's real names. But you see, if you think of a life as a work of art, then you have to look at lives as unique. You're not going to study them primarily statistically to summarize it. You're going to say, well, look at this unique composition this specific person has made. Don't imitate it. You can't imitate it. But when you have a few of these compositions, it gives you a sense of the range of possibility. And it's terribly important for people coming up on their 50s and 60s to understand the range that is open before them. Most people haven't caught on to that yet. Everybody in this room knows about it, but you also encounter people who say, well, I've retired, I've got all this free time, but I can't figure out what I want to do with it. And you've met them too, right? Okay. Now, what I found, having said I was going to write a book about aging, that I was not writing a book about aging. I was writing a book about what I came to call second adulthood, a new life stage that we can think of as inserted before old age. Old age didn't get longer when public health got better. Adulthood got longer before old age, and yet we kept a lot of the old expectations about when people marry, when children leave home, when people retire, and so on. So we created the second period of adulthood, when people are basically relatively healthy. Got to say relatively. We take a lot of pills, right? We've all had at least one condition that last century we might have died of. Our parents, the next generation up, have all passed, pretty much. Okay? So we're in an age where we have a sense of limits. We have a lot of energy, if we're lucky. We have increased freedom. We've come to the end of a chapter. And then you may have 30 years before your life is anything like the stereotype of old age that everybody absorbed as a child. It's just where women were at the time of the feminist movement. It's where people of color were at the beginning of the civil rights movement. They had to be able to imagine a major change, then that it would work. It could be done. They had to get rid of a whole set of stereotypes. We internalize these stereotypes. I can remember saying at the beginning of the women's movement, I never talk to women at parties. They just talk about their children. Uh-oh. Yeah. Suddenly dawned on me what I'd been saying. Right? My godmother went into an assisted living. And I asked her, after she'd been there for a month or so, whether she'd made any friends. And she said, oh, Kathy, everyone here is so deteriorated. But they weren't any more deteriorated than she was. I mean, it was... and it was just an assisted living. I mean, you know. The point being that women had to get rid of the internalized prejudices against themselves and other women. Right? Ditto African Americans. Ditto gays. You can't change the way people look at you unless you change the way you look at yourself. So that was a big step for me. That was the second big step, to realize that I should think of two life stages after what we think of as adulthood. A second adulthood and old age. It doesn't do much good to talk about Act 3 unless you introduce that distinction. Because Act 3 is going to involve very major changes, starting from and maintaining as long as possible an energetic, engaged, active adulthood. But we're going to acquire a few more decrepitudes as time goes on. And so let's think of these things as separate stages without clear endings and beginnings. And that's an immensely clarifying step. I think, because until you make that step, at the point where you're talking to someone who's 55 or 60 about their plans, they may be thinking, have a mental image of somebody who might be 80 now. You see, you're at cross purposes unless you make that distinction. So it's very important. And I think it's very important what people do with that period of adulthood, too. The second thing I want to say. This is literally a breakthrough in human evolution. What has happened is essentially, within a century, a doubling of the human lifetime. Well, you know, it takes longer to grow up and be a human being than it used to. If you notice that about the kids. Now, I worked with Eric Erickson for a number of years, a long time ago. I volunteered to be a TA in his course. I did it for 2 years in my 20s. And I've been doing life history stuff ever since. And one of the things that I love about Erickson's work, it's built on a Freudian base, but Erickson is interested in human strengths, not in pathology. And what are the strengths that develop at each stage of life? So as soon as I realized that I needed to think about a new stage, I asked myself the Ericksonian question, what is the strength that is developed in that stage? In Erickson's scheme, wisdom is the strength of old age. And I was talking about people. I mean, when we think of the tribal elders through history that have been critical in human communities, played really important roles. Hey, life expectancy was 40-something. You were an elder if you made it to 50, right? And you were regarded as a wise elder. Well, people at 50 don't look like that anymore. I mean, they go back and get PhDs. They start new careers. They elope. They go on round-the-world tours, right? At 60 and 70, scandalize their children. Okay. So there was some kind of overlap developing. Instead of a period of active adulthood, engaged, generativity, productive, that ends and is succeeded by old age, where you pretty much sit still and say wise things. Okay? But listen, people sitting still with memories of the past and able to guide their communities past the dangers that might come up very rarely have been critical in the survival of human communities. They were precious. They were valued by their communities. It's just we got so many now, which does affect people's attitude, and also the rate of change affects. My theory is if you're not actively learning, you can't think of yourself as wise. If you're not actively reflecting on experience, you can't think of yourself as wise. Reflecting on what you see that is new instead of judging it offhand. So I went to a conference where somebody was talking about the need for wise activism. And I thought, active wisdom. Never, I mean, if you're talking about people who would have been in the past fairly inactive because of chronic conditions of various sorts, they are still active and engaged at a time when they've had a longer life experience and richer life experience than those wise elders of the past had had. So wisdom while we're still active. You know how you can think of it? Wisdom on the hoof. And the question is where you go, right? Where you take it. Simultaneously, I was getting very concerned about the fact that in our society, even though we live longer, we are thinking shorter. More and more decisions are made on the basis of the next quarterly report, the next round of bonuses, the next congressional election. We're making bad decisions with bad implications for the future, short-term decisions. I believe that at this point in time, what we want is the wise activism of the elders with active wisdom. And I would say my mother would have said with zest. She once made the comment about women, is that the most underused resource in this country is postmenopausal women with zest. Right. Well, actually, more women are trying to stay active and engaged because the traditional idea of retirement is still set in the minds of many men. And one of the reasons for the difference is women of my generation fought for the right to work. If somebody says to me, "Aren't you looking forward to retiring and relaxing?" Well, I won't, in this company, quote what I'm likely to say. Okay? So the issue thing that I want to bring to your attention is that there is this extraordinary resource of people with this strength of active wisdom who can do more than talk about what they've learned in a lifetime and pass it on, though that's very important. They can act on it. And if possible, they can push politicians and the corporate world. And one of the ways that people think about the future is in terms of their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. You can imagine and ask yourself, well, what life are they going to have? So I started trying to organize something called Granny Voter, and Granny Voter is now gone into an alliance with Generations United and with Gray is Green, because of course the environment is the most conspicuous item on the agenda of learning to think further ahead than we now are. And a lot of people, as they get older, first of all, think more inclusively, have an increasing sense of the wider world. They've been places, they've encountered difference. A longer sense of time. Hey, they've been around. We've been around. We've watched change. We've watched, for instance, in Iran. I was living in Iran at the time of the revolution. And I know that rights can be lost. They have to be defended. They have to be defended for the future. Okay? Less black and white thinking, more tolerance for ambiguity, and frankly, I've come to believe that when we speak about legacy, what is the legacy that I want to give to the next generation? Broadly considered, a sustainable, peaceful, just world. And the way to get that, one of the ways to get that, is for older adults to involve themselves in politics, to press for such a world. Now, it's been very, very important to get beyond the extreme poverty of old people as it was described in the 60s, before the war on poverty. That's been very important. And having an organization like the AARP working on that and continuing to defend that is very important. But I believe the job that we have to, it's a little more like what the Gray Panthers did. They don't have a lot of visibility at the moment. But the Gray Panthers were not seniors advocating for seniors. They were seniors advocating for peace and social justice. And who else is going to do it? And I think people have to get to this. I'm probably over my time. People have to get to this by meeting in groups and thinking it through. That's been important in all the revolutions, social revolutions of the 20th century. Why do we care? What can we do? How can we serve as trustees for the future? Advocates for the future, for the world as it will be when we're no longer here. Okay? So it needs to start with group discussions. And I've experimented with this. And one of the things that when I've brought groups together, they have a dual issue. They want to make new friends and discuss things that matter to them with those friends. And then they're ready to look outside and think about what they might contribute. So I think that's a very important modality to work with. And you know, it's just like, well, you know that everybody, I'll say it in my own terms. If I say to you, well, I'm 72 tomorrow. I'm 72, but I don't feel 72. You've heard that 1,000 times, right? Hmm?
72 feels like you.
But you can interpret it. It just means, well, I've lived that number of years. And about 40 years ago, I internalized a very negative stereotype of what that would be like. And my experience doesn't match the stereotype. But I'm an exception. All the other people who are 72 are old. Right? When somebody says that, aren't they saying they're an exception? They're an exception to a general rule. No. They're a contradiction to an obsolete stereotype. Right? So exactly the same issues of liberation from stereotypes, of recognizing a mission, working with colleagues, peers, friends in a way that serves the larger group and the whole society. All these rights movements actually, look at how many women are contributing enormously to society now, right? Yes. This is not just self-interest. Look at what a huge boost the civil rights movement has shown to be for American society by making full participation possible for African Americans and other people of color. Right? This is not just for the group. It's something that enriches the whole society. And in terms of this short-term thinking business, we are on incredibly dangerous courses at present. We are damaging the ecological stability of the planet We are planting dragon's teeth with military adventures that will lead to, in 30, 40 years, a whole new wave of terrorists and rage. The children that stand by and see their communities violated as young children, their anger is going to come back. So, what I want to say to you, many of you helping people address the question, what's next? I think you will find that if you can give clients a sense that they are relevant, that they have a right to have opinions about the future beyond their own lifetimes, and indeed a responsibility to do that, it will be an empowerment that has outreach, has a sense of legacy to it, and I think you're going to find that it's a source of exhilaration and creativity. And I've gone on too long, but don't. I have a last sentence that I want to keep in mind that metaphor of composing a life, that the decisions we each make in the course of our lives are steps in the creation of a work of art, or a story, or a symphony, still an unfinished symphony. But that's what it's about. It is about recognizing a fulfilling, positive, productive life as itself a work of art that requires creativity. We are